Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It looks like everyone's settled. So I want to welcome today for our 33rd session of the chat time, which is organized by SEACHA, which is the Southeast Asian Cultural Heritage Alliance. So today we'll be talking about impact of heritage language models, or LLM, to heritage and culture. So to have our welcoming, a few words for welcoming remarks, I want to call on Ivan Hilares, who is our chairperson for SEACHA.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much,
Hello.
Burley, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm currently in Bangkok, where SEACHA is headquartered, but for some meetings, and I'd like to welcome you to this month's edition of Chat Time. Of course, for this edition, we're talking of the impact of large language models on heritage and culture, and this will, of course, cover a lot of generative artificial intelligence. So I'm looking forward to the discussions as well, and I won't take much of everyone's time because I know that we have a very interesting discussion up ahead. Of course, our speakers will be introduced by Burley in a bit. So again, on behalf of the Southeast Asian Cultural Heritage Alliance, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Ivan. And by the way, my name's Burley, and I'll be your host today. So, if I may introduce our speaker, he is Peter Schuper. He is a publisher and former technology entrepreneur who has made his career in Singapore. He is currently the director of the NUS, National University of Singapore Press, the scholarly publishing arm of He is past president of the Singapore Book Publishers Association and serves on a number of creative industry groups in Singapore. And internally, he was invited to speak at the first official World Intellectual Property Organization session on AI earlier this year, and has addressed groups like the World Expression Forum, Association of University Presses, and Federation of European Publishers on the same subject. So he will be presenting his lecture about impact of large language models, and then this will be moderated by this will be followed by a panel discussion with the moderators Kagay and Fauzi Ismail. So Kagay, or KG in short, as his nickname goes, focuses on making books and supporting an environment for literature, the arts and culture in Singapore and Southeast Asia. The passionate and experienced team is part of a growing ecology of independent agents producing and circulating fiction, nonfiction, and poetry that speaks to our times, including critical concerns such as climate action. While Fauzi Ismail was also in our last chat time discussion, which was talking about funding and incentives for heritage. So Mr. Fauzi is the Singapore-based director for SEACHA and the president of the Singapore Heritage Society. He is an architect with the specialization in art and architecture, history, and cultural heritage, and has a master's in nonprofit leadership and management from the University of Southern California, where he was awarded a Fulbright scholarship. So may I call on PG and Fauzi to take the Zoom floor?
Sure. Thanks so much, Burley, and also Ivan for the opening remarks. I'm Kage, publisher at Ethos Books. I think this conversation really started because of very natural affinities. Fauzi, who is the president of the Singapore Heritage Society, was checking in with me as a publisher about large language models. And I'm just thinking why we even intersected. And I believe it's because there is this shared interest in knowledge production. And knowledge production is also about knowledge recovery. and it's also about knowledge custodianship. And I think many of you in SEACHA, you are custodians of histories. And I think that's a very precious role. And I would like to make a shout out for Southeast Asia as a collective. It's more than just an economic body. I think we have shared histories that allow for us to understand how our own politics have been shaped, how our thinking about identity have been shaped. So I'm really happy to be introduced to SEACHA by Fauzi. And maybe Fauzi, you can tell us a bit about the origin of this session. How did we even want to have this particular topic? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Kage. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'm Fauzi, the president of Singapore Heritage Society, and thank you so much for all of you joining us today. So first, I'd like to start by saying this talk is orchestrated by me over a series of events that happened in my country. So let me put you a link of one of those incidents here on the chat group. So firstly, an organization approached me because of my position at SEACHA as a vice chairperson. So the organization is creating the first equivalent of ChatGPT for Southeast Asian languages. For me, I'm like, okay, cool. Because I know a lot of my friends in Southeast Asia has been using ChatGPT for their work and other things. And they said it's very good, it's been very helpful to them. And some of these AI machines has also been helpful in using languages that people don't really use anymore, like Kristang, for example, that's been used in Malacca and Singapore. So with this organization, I set up a meeting with some of the nonprofit heritage organization in Southeast Asia. So the organization told the nonprofit what their project is and asked them for all their heritage works written in the local languages. Then what surprises me was that the nonprofit organizations in Southeast Asia, they just said, sure, take all of our materials. And for me, it was shocking. I was like, okay, hold on a minute. This organization who's requesting for all your materials has not even tell you how they're going to use it, or if you're going to be compensated, or how your work is going to be churned out. It might not be the same thing that you put in. So I had told the organization that we will not participate in helping the AI to create the AI on Southeast Asian languages. And the bare minimum I did was I gave all the link of all the information that we've already uploaded online on YouTube and etc. Because ChatGPT has been using all these online materials to teach their AI machine. So after this incident, I started to talk publicly to my friends about all this issue. So a few of other organizations came up to me and says, oh yes, we have heard about this project that used heritage as a starting point for something else. So one of the projects that really struck me was there's this project that goes around collecting people's retina and pay you $5. And the retina images, they said, oh, is to help build the racial profile for your country and for the region. But at the same time, this company is selling your retina to the government for your ID or for your identification purpose. So it's like, okay, I think we need to do this public talk about large data on heritage because it's not been done before. And I really think the public needs all this information so that the public is aware and informed of what's happening and you guys have the tools to know what to do if this happened to you. So I asked Kage, because I read this article that came out about him, if you do the talk. Fortunately, he agreed. And then he asked Peter Schoppert to lead this because Peter is one of the experts in LLM and media and print media. So I will cut it short, and I think Peter can start his presentation. And over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Fauzi, and thank you so much for realizing that this is something we should probably be talking about. Burley, Kage, Ivan, Joe convene in the background. Thank you so much for convening this session. And it's wonderful to see such a great network of people here. So really we need to talk together and think this through together. There are a lot more questions than answers, but I'm going to start off with sort of some views about some information about how the models work and how they are trained, to give us a bit of a shared understanding of that, which then can help drive the discussion. So the first bit will be a little bit lecture heavy, if you will, but that's just to set up the discussion, I hope. So let me try to share screen and we can begin.
Peter, do you want me to time watch for you?
Oh, yeah. That would be very kind, because
sure. So maybe about I think we want to maybe stop at 4 o'clock for a round, sort of a Q&A, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure I won't take that long, and we can take a break after the explanation of the models, and maybe if there are questions at that point, it's probably a good idea to take them.
Fantastic.
Before we go in. So I've been going around talking to many different groups about this, and my message is really that these models are not something that comes just from a bunch of mathematicians and computer scientists who've come up with some formula. They're very much built on language and on our works. And frankly, the large language model itself is really a kind of humanistic project. It has its roots way back, and it comes out of thinking hard about language, about the disciplines of linguistics and so on. So to prove my point, I'm going to quote a visit by a novelist to one of the early labs where a large language model was being developed. So here's my agenda: humanist project, how are they made? And then we'll go in for the discussion. Okay, so this is quoting a novelist visiting an early large language model lab, a project for improving knowledge by practical and mechanical operations. Sounds a bit like large language model. You know, everybody knows how laborious the usual method is of attaining to the arts and sciences, but whereas with this machine, the most ignorant person at a reasonable charge and with only a little bodily labor may write books in philosophy, poetry, politics, law, mathematics, and theology, without the least assistance from genius or study. So the scientist brings the novelist, the hero of the novel, in, shows him the machine. The professor showed me, and then the output of the machine. The professor showed me several volumes in large folio already collected with these rich materials to give the world a complete body of all arts and sciences. However, it might still be improved and much expedited if the public could raise funds for making and employing more of such machines. He assured me that he had employed the whole vocabulary into his frame of the language and made the strictest computation of the general proportion there is in books of the number of particles, nouns, verbs, and other parts of speech. So this is a pretty good description of a large language model, and it was written in 1727. It's actually in Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift. And it captures the, I mean, I've read this to computer scientists and their minds are boggled. They're like, wow, because it really does get to the point of what a large language model is. It's a huge understanding of the statistical relationship between words as expressed in our texts, as expressed in books, articles, blog postings that have been fed into the machine. So Jonathan Swift was very thoughtful about publishing and writing, in particular at the birth of the modern scientific revolution. He was worried about these scientists. They're not really writers, but they keep wanting to publish in journals and stuff. So he was thinking about these questions and this aspiration that if we could understand the mathematical relationship between words, if we could understand it, describe it through the tools of math and science, we would know more about language. This has been an aspiration which is at least 300 years old, right? So now it's come to pass, because now we have the computers big enough, we can do the calculation. And the calculation is not just on one language, it's on many languages. A quick timeline, really the breakthrough in machine learning and AI happened in 2012, but it's really in the last 4 or 5 years that it's taken off through the large language models. The first one, the transformer model that really was effective, was BERT, created by Google in 2018. And we've gone on since then. And things have really sped up since then. So what's been happening in these last few years is a kind of increase in quantity, which has led to an increase in quality. Vast increases in scale, how much text is analyzed and is modeled. Increasingly clever software. So 2018 saw this, what they call the transformers. So this is a way of keeping more data in view when you make your predictions. So your statistical model isn't just looking at what one word ahead and one word behind. It's looking at the whole sentence, the whole paragraph, and even more. And more computing power. OpenAI estimated between 2012 and 2018 to lay the foundation for this takeoff 300,000 times more computing power. And so now we're getting, hundreds of millions of dollars spent to be able to train the model. So they're huge, they're enormous. The breakthrough in the kind of language and the data used to train these models was 2016, when Google said, wow, we really need text, we need people talking, we need language that expresses ideas over paragraphs. Before this, language models were working like one sentence at a time. So they swallowed up 11,000 novels from the Smashwords fan fiction database. So the first of these great models started with vampires and lonely werewolves, because there was a lot of that in this fan fiction. So Google swallowed all that up. Some of the authors objected, as you see in this newspaper article. And Google said, no, we're just training a model. It's nothing to do with you. Don't worry about it. And so then we got BERT, the first model, and BERT trained on 2 sources of data. One was Wikipedia, about 2.5 billion words of English Wikipedia. And the other was the 11,000 novels. This BERT Books is actually that Smashwords database. So the breakthrough came in 2017, 2018 with those models. By 2020, we now have, we went up in scale significantly. So we went from kind of 7 billion words, 10 billion tokens. We went up to 300 billion tokens. A token is the computer's version of a word. It is sometimes part of a word, sometimes a whole word. And you'll see that books were a big part of this. So a large database of books was added, and the other things they used to add were scraping from the web. And that led to a decline in quality, but on the other hand, you had more quantity, so that was better. And this was the standard for many years, and this was for 2 or 3 years. It's a fast-moving field. And this was really what gave us ChatGPT, was the breakthroughs that this model was able to achieve. But that wasn't enough. And then as the science and the engineering of this continued, Google then set a new standard and said, well, actually, we find that the models get better when we give them more better content. And so this was, the Chinchilla paper was a breakthrough of 2022, but they said it's not just a question of adding more computers and increasing the amount of analysis, it's more data that really makes the difference. And who has data? Google does. So in the Chinchilla model, they added up to 1.4 trillion tokens, something like 1 trillion words. And in that green, dark green box, Chinchilla Books, that includes 4 million books. So they fed 4 million books into the model. Now, the British Library only has 14 million books. So 4 million books is a lot of books. And that's basically the Google Books database. which publishers are still a little bit sore about. They created without our permission. And so they use that. And also a big database of about 1 billion news articles were also used to train the model. In addition to more scraping of software code and more scraping of the web. So Wikipedia, the 3 billion, all of Wikipedia, which looks pretty big, is just the small purple box down there at the bottom. So if you look at this, and now the very latest models have gone up to 3 to 5 trillion tokens. And what they're doing now is because publishers and others objected. You said, you're using all of our books, all of our content. It turns out that structured content, high quality content, really helps make the models better, which stands to reason, right? The more textbooks are particularly valuable for helping models understand how to reason step by step, for example. So now the companies have started saying, well, they've stopped sharing what goes into the models. They just say, we're using publicly available internet data. And that's true. They're using scrapes of the web, enormous web scrapes of the web. But they're using the previously trained models to filter those web scrapes, to get out the content which is most book-like, which is most article-like, which is most valuable and useful. And so they use Llama 2 to filter the huge mass of internet data to get the good stuff. And of course, there will be many books and many databases of content in there. As Fauzi said early on, content which has been exposed online on YouTube or whatever has probably already been scraped by the model makers. So, and then,
Peter,
then one of the things you hear is
Peter,
that it's, yes, sorry,
let me,
Kage.
not at all, but just to bookmark an observation and a possible discussion later, because this part is really, really fascinating. It seems like the types of processes, for example, this scraping process versus, say, like a more intentional one-to-one seeking process, it makes a difference in the quality of the LLM. But at the same time, there will be certain questions about how these processes impact on the ethics of it all, right? So, and the business of it also. I think just to park this particular observation, because yeah, it's so interesting to see. It's like almost like large sea trawling or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the feeling was, you know, just quantity in the beginning, but more and more now to improve the models further, quality becomes important. And then also you want to try to represent different kinds of content. So different languages become important. Now, one thing that tech companies say is, oh, it's so huge, you know, it's only we can handle this. It's impossible for you to even know what's in there. And that's not exactly true. And they also say it's impossible for us to tell you what these models have been trained at. That's not exactly true. So I created a list of books that had been pirated books, which had been taken from a BitTorrent site and used to train the model. And the Washington Post did a great, built a great tool where you could search into one of these data sets from Google, the C4 data set, which is also crawled from the web, and search and see if your website has been used. So I'd recommend that if you're interested. Now, there's an interesting digital heritage angle here, because the companies that do the web crawling, I mean, the groups that do the web crawling are mostly nonprofits. There's just a couple. And they do it because they want to archive the web and because governments and national libraries haven't been doing it. But the problem, and so most publishers said, yeah, that's a great idea, you know, because we need an archive of the web. We want to see what the web was like 20 years ago. We go to the Internet Archive. So there is a kind of digital heritage aspect of it. But now that same archive is being used to train the models, which are now competing with the publishers and are, you know, allowing the models to create output, which is like that of artists and writers and publishers. So people are starting to say, well, hold it, maybe I don't want my things to be archived. But that's not a very good outcome either, right? Because we need, it's a very good thing to have an archive of the web. So we're kind of stuck with all of these tensions. But I think it's very important to make the point that it is possible to know what the models are trained on. It's possible to analyze it. Some of it you can even do on your own computer. And I'll say one thing good about the Singapore projects that Fauzi mentioned. They have been quite transparent in publishing their data so far. They've been sharing what data they've used to train the models. So that at least is a best practice. And here's one analysis I did of the different publishers whose books were used in the first Llama model from Facebook without their permission. And I did it by publisher, but you could as well have done it by author. So it's possible to analyze. So, like I said, it's not just math. It's math plus data, and the data is in the machine. It's in the machine in very interesting ways. So our texts are in the machine, represented in statistics. That means they can be reproduced. So you can ask the model to give me a paragraph from The Great Gatsby, and it will do that. You can ask it to do Harry Potter, and it will do that unless the companies have blocked it. And I'll talk a little bit about that before. But they also produce new things. They also produce new text that the statistical model says is possible, is likely to have been there. So they're really language machines. They're about language. They're not really about the world. They don't know facts. They don't know that Paris is the capital of France. They just know that they've seen a lot of sentences that say Paris is the capital of France. So it's a relationships of language. That means they make things up. They hallucinate. This problem has not gone away. It means that they bullshit. And sorry to be a bit rude, and not in the sense that they're trying to lie or anything. It's just that they have no relationship with the truth. I mean, maybe you have a colleague like that, right? Who, when you ask them a question, they don't know the answer. They give you a very, it sounds good, like, oh, wow, that's plausible, but actually they don't know. So the model's a bit like that. Humans can be like that too. And then they reproduce the average. They because it's a statistical model, they will always give you what is most present in the data. And that means that they reproduce bias. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. Now, I have to add, to be fair to my computer science friends, that I keep saying that it's just a statistical model of language, but it turns out that a statistical model of language has a lot of knowledge about the world inside it, right? Just through the relationships of words that is a kind of knowledge. And so the real fans of these large language models believe that, they're actually predicting. Prediction is a statistical phenomenon, but to predict, you have to somehow understand. So this is the kind of scientific philosophical question that is at the heart of the models, in which we're learning more and more about every year. Now, the other very important thing, so what I always try to tell people, it comes from humanism. It uses works, writing, content, not just data, but ideas, content, expression, and they're complicated systems. There's not one model. So AI is a system. And it's very hard to just speak of AI as one thing, right? We have to learn to be more precise. And it's a system that starts with data creation. All data is created by humans. It may be weather data, but that's not data until we write it down, right? It's just phenomena. So data isn't protected by copyright, by the way, but it is a human creation nonetheless. And if you look in China, for example, they're thinking quite hard about this and trying to think of, well, personal data and data of my behavior online and so on. Isn't that, how do I, well, we're all thinking about this, not just in China, but in China, they're talking about data as a factor of production. It's quite interesting. So you have all this data, then you curate it and put it together. And that's the folks that Fauzi's talking about in the organization that are going around trying to look for data, more information that uses Asian languages, Southeast Asian languages, and so on. The next phase is the training. And that's the big model, training the big model. This is what we call these models foundation models, because they're kind of very powerful, but not very well directed models that need direction and adaptation, which is the next stage. The foundation model just predicts the next word in a sequence, but that's not necessarily very helpful. To make them helpful and to keep them from being harmful, we do the adaptation. And so that is different processes, fine-tuning, and giving human feedback. I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. So that adaptation, I would say that the progress over the last 3 years anyway, 2 or 3 years, has mostly been in adaptation. It's not like there was a huge jump in the amount of computing power between GPT-3 and GPT-4. What they did is actually create a series of smaller models and put them together and work very hard on the adaptation, plug it in to the internet so that it could go find information online and so on. Then the models are deployed, and they're deployed by the owners of the models, or in some cases put into kind of open source. And those models we can use, right, as users. But what we're seeing much more of is that the models are then being used to create new applications. And so they are fine-tuned, their various further processes go on if somebody offers the model. And I'll show you one example of this from Singapore's National Library later on when we look at heritage. So this adaptation phase is really fascinating. Here's a graphic from a great paper published by a research institute at Stanford, which kind of alerted me to the different kinds of adaptation that go on. So, I mean, it's one, you know, a model that predicts what word comes next is not in itself super useful if you want questions answered, if you want software code to be written. You need to specialize them in these tasks. So you need to do a lot of task specialization and training. That don't just give me the next word, answer the question. And so there's a process, a different kind of training, reinforcement learning to do that. Model patching. So like we said, the models can repeat the data that they were trained on. That is sometimes embarrassing if they will, because it shows you've trained your model on copyrighted data and you don't want to reproduce that. So they have put up various patches to try to block that from happening, fact checking. And then a big one, if you've seen that some of the newspaper companies around the world have done deals with the AI model providers, it's mostly around this. It's not really, so far as I can tell, it's not really around training the foundation model. It's around this temporal adaptation. So giving it, updating it, giving it information and knowledge so that it can be updated. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that works. So, okay, so models are statistics, and yet they're saying all kinds of things, right? We talk to them. People have AI girlfriends and boyfriends, probably mostly men having girlfriends, but you know, they're becoming, they're used in so many ways already. But why do they say what they say? Well, they don't have any will, any volition. Statistical model is about correlation. This word is associated with that word. This sentence would be associated with that sentence. We've always, you know, we always have to worry about this. Correlation is not the same as causation. So there's no causation in the models, but they can be guided and trained to say things in certain patterns that we like. And that's this reinforcement learning, to constrain them to give answers which are useful in a certain use case, and to stop them from saying, okay, here's how you build a bomb, or here's how you build a biological weapon. So this kind of training, and here's a graphic from Facebook, Meta, about the training of one of their models. So you see the pre-training here. This is the training of the foundation model. And then the supervised fine-tuning is to help it be a chat so that it can talk to you, so that it knows that it should respond to you. So that's a fine-tuning. You give it more data that shows conversations between people. And so it starts to understand what a conversation is. I'm sorry about the anthropomorphization. It doesn't really understand anything, but it starts to be constrained to follow those patterns. And then there's the fine tuning. So the output of the chat comes around and we get the human feedback. And so you say, oh, that's a terrible answer. Don't say that. That's offensive. No. Oh, that's very helpful. Yes, reward. Oh, don't say that. That sounds, you've just copied something from a paper. You shouldn't be copying. So this process of training, OpenAI said they use 40,000 hours of training to get the models, of human feedback, to get the models to be useful. And of course, who provided that training? Outsourced workers in Kenya and Nigeria mostly. I don't know if any workers in other countries in Southeast Asia were used or not. I wouldn't be surprised if they were. So human labor is also very much part of this. A lot of human labor is very much part of this. So like I said, they don't have truth value. I mean, there's not a person there. Speech is about people communicating. And so some of the linguists and so on say, oh, they're just parrots, stochastic parrots. We should ignore them completely. They're not useful. But the fact is, we know they're useful. And so meaning, comes in different contexts. And so we do respond to the output of these models in some ways as if they're humans. So it's very difficult to sort this out. It's a very powerful tool that has been created with these models, and we lack the tools for understanding it. We have this tendency, I mean, there are very few animals in the world, monkeys, humans, and the Asian elephant, apparently, who recognize themselves in mirrors. They see a mirror and they say, oh, that's me. And so that capacity to visualize that, oh, is that another animal? Like, have you ever seen woodpeckers go to mirrors? I saw this once in Fort Canning in Singapore, and they are attacking the mirror because they think that's another woodpecker rival. But more intelligent creatures will say, oh, no, that's not somebody else, that's me. Children learn it about 3 years old. It takes them before they learn it. So this is this capacity in our brain to empathize and to want to communicate. We have this theory of mind. And so when we see a model that sounds like a person, knows things like a person, talks like a person, we start to behave as if it's a person, but it's not. So that opens us to all sorts of vulnerabilities and so on. So maybe that's a good place to pause. If there are any questions about the training of the model, and we can dig in a little bit more to this further training and teaching the model values, which then becomes important for us in heritage concerns.
Yeah, I mean, just as a bridge, right? What I find very helpful is that you kind of you anatomize the LLM so that we understand how it works and how it is useful, and it also tells us how the LLM itself becomes better. How does the input go into the LLM in various ways? And I think we can all locate ourselves in some of the processes, because some of us are probably have been approached to contribute data. Some of us may be contributing data by using ChatGPT because it goes into their like database. So I think this is a helpful kind of bridge. And I think to make it relevant to SEACHA, right, which is a lot to do with history and heritage. I think at the end of after Peter has shared his presentation, we also have a little focus on, say, indigenous knowledge, practices that are in fact held in special custodianship. Sometimes some of you in this chat group, you have access to that. So how do you then gel it with this LLM that is clearly going to become very important in future? Yeah, so just a little bridge. Anybody wants to pose questions to Peter? Yeah. You can also type it in the chat to everyone if you have any question. Yeah. I'm not sure whether Burley and Fauzi yourselves, because yesterday we had a little rehearsal and there were already like very nice, sparkly conversations. Yeah.
If not at this moment, I mean, the rest of it should be very interactive. So I just wanted to kind of get convey that understanding of the models, and then that the rest of this I think is much more open-ended. Now, one of the issues that you have, so you've trained the model to be helpful, and you've tried to make it not safe. But my idea of what is helpful and what is safe might be different than your idea. So about 2 years ago, OpenAI started realizing, oh gosh, what we think is acceptable for people in terms of values is not going to be acceptable in another context. And what do we do about this? Oh my gosh, we're just, scientists and engineers. And yet we're getting all these questions about this, the model doesn't believe in God, or the model only speaks American, or all the sort of questions about how it behaves. Why doesn't the model know about my particular culture? So this has kind of led to a new development. So one of the things that happened, so one of the things that model companies really wanted to do was not be attacked, right, for being biased, because previous machine learning models were really being attacked very heavily for being biased. If you don't work very hard, and the engineers understood this, if you don't work very hard to make sure that your data is complete, you can reproduce bias. So there was a famous case of a resume screening company, and because it had successes of resumes of people who got the jobs, and the resumes of the people who got the jobs were disproportionately men. And so then when you run another resume in there, the model decides that being a man is useful. But in fact, that's not what the model is supposed to be looking for. It's supposed to be looking for skills. So this problem in the old AI led the new companies to be very scared about bias. So what they did is they say, okay, if I search for images of, if I ask the model to give me images of doctors, and it gives me only male doctors, I'm going to be attacked, only white male doctors, I'm going to be attacked for having a biased model. So they created systems to inject diversity into the models. And the results of this were sometimes a little bit odd. When Google launched their latest image creation model, they put these in there. And so if you ask for founding fathers of America, you got a very ethnically diverse group of founding fathers. And, it's not, so there were two reactions to this. Of course, the right went crazy. Oh, this is woke, gone nuts, and how dare you, and, so impossible, and so on. And the left is like, well, it's not exactly historically accurate, but it's kind of cool, so it's hard to manage. And what is happening here is not something that's done by the model. It's the companies trying to tweak them in order to get results which are acceptable. So it's kind of trying to imbue values in the model. And should the value be, we want to show diversity, even if that diversity didn't exist at the time? Or should the value be, we want to be historically accurate, right? So this is one of the things that has come up. And this has led to a push for sovereign models. So you've got, I think this is a very legitimate concern. These tools are so powerful. How can we have them dictated by the folks in San Francisco? How can the whole world can't use models that are created in Beijing or San Francisco? We need to have our own input and our own agency into how these models are done. So countries around the world are looking to create sovereign models. And this is the group that approached Fauzi is trying to do this on a Southeast Asian level. And where does that sovereignty come in? Where does that nationalism come in? It comes in data creation. It comes in at all stages. So some countries are training their own models from scratch. I was just discussing with the Norwegian Research Institute and they're training their own models purely on Norwegian content and on Norwegian language. Some folks think you don't need to do that. We can just do it in the adaptation. Some folks are saying, well, in order to get a model that responds to, say, Southeast Asian languages, we need to get more Southeast Asian content in. And so that's why we're starting to hear about it. Almost every country in Southeast Asia, there's some national level. And then Singapore is also working at what level of cooperation, I'm not 100% sure, with other countries to do regional models as well. But it's off to a slow start. Well, we can talk a little bit about that later. So that's why they're interested. Let me switch a little bit and say, why should we be interested? Well, what are the applications for heritage workers and organizations? Well, as an academic and publishing, Southeast Asian humanities and social science, I'm really intrigued by the ability to analyze heritage data. The tools, because they're statistical models of language, they enable us to do analysis in ways that is super interesting. So they're already helping us to sort through data, to pull out names of places from large texts and so on, which they can do because they understand the data. Very early days, but I think we're going to see a explosion of really interesting humanities research based on the power of the models, not to generate new content, but to analyze existing content. A case which is kind of half-half is on education. I mean, they're already, I don't know how many of you guys are using it, but think of some of the qualities of these chatbots. They never get tired. They're very patient. They speak to you at your level because they learn your preferences. And they have a big database. I mean, especially if they're connected to the web, they have a big database of information. It won't always be accurate, but hang on, not all of my teachers were accurate too, right? No human is perfectly accurate. I was fed a lot of wrong information in my youth. But so they actually are, I think, are going to be super useful, and we should think about this positive side as well. But it's the generative part which is hard. The capability to generate new content also comes with huge risks, I think, for the heritage sector. So here's a positive one. This is a project. We got a presentation from the researchers last week in Singapore. It's analyzing no performance, Japanese traditional theater, high quality digitization as a first step to allow you to really closely read and look at what is the music doing, what is the voice and the text doing, what is the performance doing. And then once you have that incredible digitized, high quality digitized video, you can then start to analyze how much movement is going on in this section. So if you see this down here, this is kind of a measure of movement. So we can start to do different kinds of analysis. My friend Miguel at the NUS has been using this to analyze Wayang theater. So first, just analyzing newspaper or actually Facebook information about Wayang performances across Java, where the most, there's this myth that, Wayang is dying out. And he's able to prove with this kind of data of analysis that actually there are more performances than there ever were. And that they're in places you don't expect. Chillicap, which is this area over here, which you don't think of as a cultural heartland of Java, but actually has this thriving Wayang culture. So you're able to get real data about important heritage questions, not just impressionistic data. So, and you can only really do this with the tools of big data analysis and of LLMs in particular. And we have one case in Singapore for education. So the National Library worked on a project to take a book about one of our founding foreign minister and the person who wrote our Singapore National Pledge, S. Rajaratnam. So they took that book and some of his speeches and some of his writings and put it into a database. This is called the RAG model, our Retrieval Augmented Generation. They put it into a database, and so the large language model gets a question, and it turns that question into a statistical representation, and it uses that to go back and pull out information from the database. And then it takes that input and rewrites it as an answer. So you have here, you can talk, you can't talk to Rajaratnam himself. That would have been that was too audacious. But you can talk to an archivist who's an expert on his writings, and it will answer questions about Rajaratnam. In this case, they're actually working with the book and with Rajaratnam's own speeches and so on, which means less hallucination, closer to the content. It very clearly requires permission of the copyright holders, because you're not just asking the big soup of the model. You're actually you're actually copying content from the book and feeding it into the prompt, which is going into the model. But by all accounts, I've only used it a little bit, but it's quite an interesting way of, thinking about being able to have your questions answered. And the librarians could do that, but now we can do it at scale. But there are other uses and other things we can do with generative content. And here I want to play one example.
Imagine a world where the Philippines was never conquered by the Spaniards. What would our ancestors look like? What would our cities look like? Let's take a glimpse into this alternate reality and ask, AI, what if?
So the creators of this video in the Philippines, Gerald Mira, have got the right spirit. I think they're saying, hey, don't take this too seriously. In this
video, we'll be exploring a world where the Philippines were never conquered by the Spanish. Imagine the Philippines were not colonized. And
let me skip ahead, because I know there'll be quite a few architects in the audience. Let me skip ahead to the imagining of the cities.
Imagine a world where the Philippines was never conquered by the Spaniards.
Oops, sorry.
Free of their struggles and...
There we go. That looks more like a Marvel movie, I think, but. So what do we notice about that? Sorry, what do we notice about that? It's not very clever. I mean, it doesn't really, I mean, it's super clever, but it doesn't really have a lot of local content, right? It doesn't really know much about Philippines architecture. It sort of messes all Southeast Asian architecture up in one go and so on. But, somebody has used it to try to stimulate their imagination. I'm very ambivalent in my thoughts about this. Is this good or bad? And I'd love your opinions and your views on that. But I do want to say that it's not difficult to do. So we can, the ability to create images, which we've been talking about text, but the problem is also here with images. This took me about 20 minutes. I just fed in some pictures I had of myself on the computer. Apparently, I never smile in photographs. Fed it into a model and trained it to create new images in all kinds of styles using my face. So, me as a member of the Spanish national football team, or me as if I'd been painted by Degas or Monet or something. And it really is very easy to do. So there's power here. I mean, there's lots of power to do stupid things, for example, my pictures, but there's power, and there might be power to expand the imagination, but for me, it's overwhelmed by the power to do harm and to create misinformation and disinformation at huge scale. And so right now in Korea, I mean, 200 schools, secondary schools in Korea have Telegram groups dedicated to deepfake porn of the students in the school. I mean, the Koreans are freaking out. It's the most awful thing. And, that deepfake power comes from these models as well. So the ability to fake heritage content and say, hey, look at this inscription that I found, or manuscript that I found, or image that I found, when it's actually been created, or here's a recording I found of a speech that the Prime Minister of Singapore gave that, I just found in a drawer, which is actually, I mean, this is going to be very difficult. So we're mostly worried about this in terms of politics. But I do think it's also going to be a question for, and we're already seeing a lot of fake scientific data coming in. It's also going to be a problem for heritage. So should we make heritage content available for AI training? Well, I think there is an argument, but we need answers. We need to understand how it's going to be used. So Fauzi said it up front, and I think it's absolutely true. You have to tell us how it's being used. What is your strategy for creating a national model? Who is in control of this model? Who is benefiting from the use of this model? We need that to be a conversation. And right now, the tech guys are just in such a rush, in such a hurry, that we're, at least in Singapore, we're not getting those answers yet. I'm confident we will, but we're not yet. And secondly, if you're looking at digitizing things, well, don't do it for the model. Let's do it for the heritage community. Let's do it for scholars. So I would say, okay, it's a good idea to digitize manuscripts from monasteries in Thailand, but only let's do that as heritage workers first. Let that be the priority, not because we want the model to understand Pali or Mon languages, right? We should be doing it for reasons that make sense to us as researchers, and then if it works for the models, and then if they're not, the other issues. Now, what are the issues you think about? Publishers have come up with this idea of credit, publishers and authors, of credit, consent, and potentially compensation. And even if compensation isn't important, I mean, I think it's very instructive. The first lawsuit against generative AI didn't come from writers or artists. It came from open source coders, because they said, look, we write software for free. We think it's a public good to write open source software that everyone can use, and we're happy to do it. But what we get out of it is our name, credit. You go to my GitHub page and you see I wrote all this software. These were my contributions. And with AI, that's all gone. Microsoft swept all of that stuff up and creates a tool that allows anybody to write software. And it's all a big soup. We've lost that feeling of community. And that was the first lawsuit, not people worried about copyright. I think that's very instructive and very powerful. And then what Kage alluded to at the bridge, what are the ethical considerations? I mean, they apply really to digitizing content in general, and all the more so when it goes into an AI. Because once you've allowed content to go into the AI, you've lost the tethering to whatever context you want to give to that content. So some of the ethical considerations, if you give this content, will the AI be able then to replace the work of the creators? So commercial artists and animators and so on do not want to give content for training for the AIs, because it allows people to imitate their work and hurts their business. It's already happening. And there's a lot of talk, we should get all the minority languages and indigenous languages into the model. I'm not so sure, because that means that majority groups can now sock puppet. I mean, they can now imitate and these voices in these languages. So I think we do need to think carefully about this, and be very careful about especially indigenous knowledge, but really all creation of, and especially if it's come from a community that is not working on a purely commercial basis. You may say, you're not earning money from this, therefore we should digitize it. But there actually are all of these other considerations that should be taken into account.
Wow,
I will stop.
fantastic. Yeah, this is really fantastic, because I think we have a grounding in what the discussion can be about. Firstly, I think besides the LLM itself, Peter, you also point to the rules of engagement in an AI environment, because that's the larger framework that determines how people behave, how organizations behave. So I think we should also have a chat about that. The what are the new rules of engagement that we are seeing? Because as far as I notice right now, it seems like cowboy town in the AI world because the laws are struggling to keep up. And I just came from a New York conference at the start of the year, and the laws are still not in place. And that's where the battleground can be led, because I think the US, in terms of litigation, they are usually the fastest. Yeah. So that's the first thing. Let's talk about AI and the environment and the kind of rules that we are seeing. And of course, you have already started us thinking very much about how the LLM itself, it almost seems inevitable. So how do we then work with the LLM? And I'm hoping that this discussion, so Burley and Fauzi, if you have been sort of like triggered by certain points or stimulated by certain ideas, that's when you can start us with a few notes. And I hope that the other people in this group, if you have thoughts, Burley has put in a note in the chat that you can also type in your questions. Yeah, so maybe I think as a start, Burley or Fauzi, any things you want to bring in based on the two lines that I've drawn out, the AI rules of engagement and also the LLM itself. And because you also come from your roles in SEACHA and also I believe Burley, you come from this particular heritage group. Yesterday you were telling us, Joe and you are from, in fact, let me see, this Heritage Conservation Society, HCS, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll start with what Kage, you previously mentioned very briefly about ethics on organizations creating LLM and how data has been crawled. And I also would like to bring in the issue of ethics on users as well, people who use LLM, and how I think we should be mindful on how we use LLM. And it brings back to what Peter talked about power previously. So like a few weeks back, SEACHA asked me to do a talk on climate change and world heritage. So they were like, okay, young person, go talk about heritage. And I didn't want to do it, but sometimes in life you are forced to do things to do whether you like it or not. So I said yes. And I prepared the presentation only 30 minutes before, and I used ChatGPT for the entire thing. And what I was surprised was that it was able to accurately pinpoint what the previous speaker was talking about. I was like so surprised on the accuracy. I was like, okay, I should be more mindful and use this in a more responsible manner, because this tool can replace me, or it can even replace my critical thinking. I can just be lazy, and then everything I do now is ChatGPT. So yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on being a responsible user.
Yeah.
You were irresponsible because you didn't want to do it as well. Right?
But that's a very good point about it can replace your critical thinking, I think, because I think that may be the maybe a future concern for the younger generation, where critical thinking on itself is almost, you know, gone because everybody has already made the data models, or there has to be some kind of continuing passage of knowledge for the younger generation to still be able to critically think, I think.
Yeah, from the academic perspective, it helps us to do speed reading, right? To look at huge amounts of data and pull things out, to summarize. I mean, they're very good at summarizing bodies of text and so on. But we can't much as and so this is very useful, right? We have so much information coming in, but it cannot replace close reading and slow reading.
Yeah.
And very, close attention to text and being able to read texts. So in the digital humanities field, when I look at studies that are being done, that's always the sweet spot. I can do this analysis of 10,000 videos of Wayang, and I can give you ideas of how the form is changing. But then I combine that with a very close reading where I'm attending very closely to one performance and telling you what's happening and what everything means in that performance. So we need both at the same time. And so I would just always look out for that. In terms of the ethics, one thing I'll say is that I never use AI generated images in anything that I share. And that's out of respect for the artists, because I mean, even that video I showed you from the Philippines, right? That's, I mean, I'm kind of okay with the motive, but I wouldn't want to do that myself, because the artists whose works have been copied without their permission to enable the models to create that, and who've already seen their livelihoods being harmed. So I'm a little bit boring in that I really do object, and I tell people, you know, hey, you're using it in your newsletter. I'm not, you know, I'm going to unsubscribe. I've unsubscribed from a few, not all. I can't quite be 100% consistent in that. But I do think in the image side, it's pretty clear we really shouldn't be using these models as of now, out of respect to the artists whose work has been copied.
Yeah,
It's
this
part of the
idea.
text.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Like knowing when to say no. I think ethics is starts when you say no to what you can do, right? So that's the interesting thing, because AI is all about enabling and making things possible. So you can do so many things now, but what do you do with it? I was thinking, Peter, also from our own experiences as publishers, right? Are there any standards that would be very helpful to guide this audience on when to say no? For example, photocopiers have been around for a longest time. Nowadays, I think they are kind of like getting a bit passé, but books have had to contend with photocopying technology. And of course, the IP framework grew to protect that as well. And then we have, for the publishing world in Singapore, we have CLAS, which administers like this kind of copyright regulation. So if we draw an analogy to how sort of laws and also practices emerge to deal with technologies. So I wonder for you, can you share some light on maybe what you foresee? Because you're kind of a crystal gazer for IT as well. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've been talking with a lot of the copyright organizations. It's going to be it's a very confused situation. So, but I think that tech companies are mostly, certainly the European law now, is that you need permission to copy for training, and that that you can copy. You need not permission, but companies have an opt out. So I can say this material cannot be. We hope that there'll be a kind of Brussels effect where the whole world, because if you want to use your model in Europe, you have to follow that rule. And right now, some of the companies are holding back their models in Europe for that reason. But I think that's a reasonable standard, because, you know, if a AI learns to if a self-driving car learns to recognize a stop sign from my photographs, that makes me happy. And I don't really care, right? But if it learns how to make pictures in my image, in my style, then I'm not happy. So, you know, I need to have a choice. And if ideally I can give some models the permission and some not. But it's a long way to that phase. You mentioned the US and the US being quick. Well, the problem with the US is that the US decides, has a principle-based approach, the fair use approach. So, and who decides if something is a fair use? The courts. So it's not just that Americans love lawsuits and like paying lawyers, but that's how that's how the copyright law works. You have to decide if something is fair in court. It's got advantages and disadvantages. I think we won't get a clear answer for years. That's the problem, because there'll be decisions and then there'll be appeals and then it'll go to the Supreme Court. And even then, it's the law works very much on a case-by-case basis. So even then, it won't be 100% super clear. But I think the principle that creators need to have a say in what goes on is becoming more and more widespread.
So, you know, because in place of existing legislation that is clear, we probably want to have some temporary kind of measures or guides. So are there any sort of references that we can sort of go to, you think, that would be helpful? It could even be because we have some IP framework in place that can translate very nicely and neatly into the heritage space. Yeah.
Yeah, I wish copyright always had clear, bright lines, but I think, I think copyright is a good tool is one of the tools for thinking this through. The other thing is very important is the credit, right? But so that's why I said if you have heritage materials and you have thought about, I mean, the first step is to think about digitizing them and making them public. So there are many things that it's wonderful to digitize and make public, and to share. And so as long as you have the right permissions, as long as there's the right context and the right background information there, then, go ahead and share it and make it public on a Creative Commons license, is the kind of license which we've developed for sharing. And then if it's trained from the AI, it's probably not a problem because, the permission is there already. These are materials that can be understood that are okay to be decontextualized a little bit. And so you're probably all right. But I mean, we were talking about indigenous knowledge. I mean, my friends in the University of British Columbia Press have been doing a lot of publishing and working with indigenous groups in the Pacific Northwest. So they created a website called Raven Space, which is open access. But in order to access the material, you have to enter into a conversation and you have to sort of learn the values of the community that created the content. And so they have a full range. They have stuff that they're preserving, which they will not share. It's preserved digitally, it's not shared. Then there's material which they don't mind sharing, but you have to enter a conversation with members of the community to show that, you're worthy of being brought into this conversation and you're not going to misuse the knowledge. So I think that's also a very interesting model. I haven't seen much of these conversations yet in Southeast Asia about traditional or indigenous knowledge, but I'm sure we will, because I know there's a lot of work being done in Philippines, in Malaysia, with Orang Asli communities and so on. So I think that will be an interesting step.
Yeah, there is a comment in the chat group, which we can look at, but a very immediate response to Peter is that is such a great test case of what's happening, because it kind of mirrors how in real life, when you enter a sort of a sacred space, there will be traditional practitioners who are sort of safeguarding that space, and you can't just go in without having a connection or without being assessed to be properly able to deal with the knowledge, right? So very interesting that a digital space can employ such protocols as well. So lovely example. So I think it's Joseph, is it, in the chat group? Oh, Joshua, sorry. Joshua has put in this comment: heritage education or interpretation requires retelling the various layers of history associated with the place. The various layers of narrative makes the place important for a specific community. That's speaking directly to what you just said. So I think this is where LLM will become problematic, at least for now. It generates responses based on text it has been trained on, and despite the huge volume of texts, there's always a possibility that the texts are politically biased in the first place. Without human intervention, AI responses may fail to tell the different layers of narratives associated with heritage sites. So in Southeast Asia, the question is, how can AI tell the colonial history tied to a lot of heritage sites? Yeah.
Listen, AI is not a good source for heritage information because it's mushing everything up, it's decontextualizing everything, and it's going to always go to the average. And so if you have hundreds of years of talking about history in a certain way, that's going to be preponderantly how the AI will talk about history. So don't think of it, but so the question is, what do we do then? So one answer is, oh, well, let's train the AI not to be colonialist and racist. And that's a natural impulse, and that's an interesting research project. But I don't think that's the answer. The answer should be, no, let's teach each other not to use the AI to answer those kind of questions. Or if you do, be very, very skeptical, treat it as an exercise in understanding what is the old view, not what your view should be. So if you're interested in those narratives that Joshua was talking about, exactly, find the original sources of the narratives, talk to the communities, find those sources. So, that I think Joshua's absolutely right. I think the answer is not let's change the models to do something they're not designed to do. Let's more deeply appreciate the heritage materials and communities and people, individuals with their own perspectives that we're talking to.
So interesting that the idea of how to use the AI comes in, because if we can't sort of do some things at the input level, because I think the tech companies have access and they will be able to find access in their own ways, then maybe at the user end, when people are using it, we need to spread the awareness that don't use AI to get site-specific heritage knowledge and things like that. So that could be this response as well. But based on an independent publisher's perspective, usually mainstream behaviors are not so so good. Yeah, so
that's right. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. Yeah.
Any thoughts from Burley, Fauzi, anyone else? I think we are good for maybe 1-2 more questions. Yeah.
So I have a question with the I'm not sure what the name was, the Ragman model.
Yeah.
So it's from this particular person, and they trained this AI to be an archivist.
Yeah.
So it's as if they trained a person to answer everything related to his past life or his thoughts as a person.
Well, you can ask the model anything. Yeah. No, I think this. Yeah.
Does this mean this? What do you call the model again? The RAG.
RAG is retrieval augmented generation. So I'm generating content, but I'm doing so after retrieving, real relevant data. So I'm not just going to the big soup model and getting an average answer. I'm trying to constrain, and I'm trying to use data that I know and that I trust, and then use that to generate an answer which should be closer to the source.
So when you were talking about sovereign AI, this is what they want to achieve, this kind of RAGMAD model that is contextualized in a nationality?
Wow, super great question, because this question of making the sovereign AI model is at all stages. So this RAG is a little bit mechanical because it works with the text that you collect. So yes, I mean, it could be. I've been approached by our library, for example, to say we want to create something like this for other content. And so I might give permission for that because it's a small project done by researchers that I know and that we can control and we can learn a lot from. So I've been telling publishers, and I would say the same to heritage groups, for this kind of RAG project where someone approaches you to experiment with this, give it a try. Don't sign away that you're, but give it a try and be careful about it and be involved and learn from it. And so with our National Library in Singapore, we said, okay, great that you did this project, but the quid pro quo is you have to share with all the publishers what you've learned. So we have a session next week where they're going to share what the process was and what they learned about it. The sovereign AI folks are looking a little bit at a bigger scale. So they're more doing the fine tuning and the reinforcement learning. So for example, in China, the sovereign AI model in China, they've come up with a list of 20,000 questions apparently, or variations on questions about politics that they don't want the models to answer. And so they've trained the model through this reinforcement learning to say, oh, sorry, that's not a question I can answer. By the way, what's your phone number again? I'm going to send, you may expect a visit from the Public Security Bureau. No, I'm kidding about that last part. But literally, a sovereign AI model in China is a model that won't answer certain questions about history, or that will, that will block those questions and treat them in a different way. So you have many, many ranges, and the technical means by which you do it. RAG is the kind of more very specific, small scale thing you can do, and then fine tuning, but is a kind of bigger model wide training that you can do. But you're exactly right. It's in all of these areas that we're trying to learn how to make the models useful and relevant, and try to prevent them from, being misused or being too misleading to people and so on.
Yeah, it was so alarming with your comment. I mean, with your share about the Koreans using the
Yeah.
with
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
awful, right? I mean, what a horrible, awful thing. And, yeah, okay, Korea is particularly patriarchal, and, particularly got this streak in its culture, but, don't be surprised when it comes to our countries too. So, and then and then what will the reaction be? There'll be a big panic, of course. Will it be, I know, so interesting times ahead.
Thanks, Burley. Any other thoughts or
sorry.
questions? Yeah.
There's a comment here by Tian Yin. She
Mm-hmm.
says, Prof. Schubert, what is your current work in using AI in the heritage domain? Do you serve as a consultant for heritage institutions such as museums and government bodies? How do you stay updated on the latest developments in the use of AI in heritage around the world?
Tian, thank you for the promotion. I unfortunately don't have a PhD. I'm a publisher. So like Kage, I'm interested in many, many things and know a lot about, I know a little about many subjects. My focus has really been on the publishing side of it. So I'm and on the copyright side of it. So I work in the International Publishers Association. I serve on the copyright group. And so it's in that context that I've really come to learn all of this. And then also as NUS Press, National University of Singapore Press, we do quite a bit of digital publishing. And so we're also working with academics in, right now, mostly at NUS, but in other institutions. What sort of new things can we do with this technology? What research questions can we take forward? So we're doing a lot in archaeology and a lot in performing arts at the moment. Nothing yet to publish, but coming soon, I hope. It's very hard to stay updated. Oh my goodness. There's so much happening.
Is there a website like last time there used to be a Boing Boing for
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but for AI, is there an equivalent?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are a couple newsletters. I have a newsletter myself that I have not been able to keep up. And then there are a couple services with sort of headlines from around the world, but it's very hard to keep up. Substack is a good place. I used to get a lot of AI information on Twitter, but Twitter is just so nasty to go to now. So yeah.
Fantastic.
Twitter.
Sorry.
Oh,
Oh, Burley, please take it forward from here. I think, yeah.
no, speaking of Twitter, Twitter's like always talking about false data, fake news, right? And this is kind of the same problem we're seeing. Actually, not the same problem we're seeing, but the same problem that we're scared of, that in the heritage field, that it might provide data that is misinformed or not true, right? But then it's also the same problem years ago. And even with like, or it's not even misinformation, it's more like the data being controlled by a higher body, or so it's kind of the same problem, but only in a bigger scale, because it's more easily accessible and more widespread. So I guess that's where our fear is coming from.
Yes, and
Okay.
authoritative sources of information could be oppressive, but at least you know where you stood. You're like,
Yeah.
okay, I believe this, or I know that it's wrong and I struggle against it. But in the information environment that we're in now, it's so scattered, and it's so many bubbles, and it's very, yeah, it's I think the change in scale is a real change also in the quality of the problem. So it's more sources, more disinformation, but then it can lead to unmooring of our sense of reality, which I worry about a little bit. Yeah, but that's me being a little bit maybe paranoid and old fogyish. I'm
No,
sure young people growing up in
No.
this will learn how to navigate through this
I think
in their
the
own ways.
concern is real because it's affecting our concept of knowledge as well, right? The source of knowledge itself. So I think Burley and your last two statements, right? It points us to how AI may in fact reconfigure the concept of authority in terms who's actually able to decide on what's right as well. Yeah.
I mean, it's not all bad. Please don't. I mean, it's very easy to get to think about all the bad things, but this new conception of knowledge could also be quite exciting because it is an amazing ability to synthesize. But so for me, the battle is this: it's whether we lose. There's the risk of losing authenticity, and losing the connection to the individuals who came up with the ideas and the thoughts. And so the AI is a tool to help us understand, to search. I mean, I'm using AI-powered search to look at research papers now. Very interesting tools, but I'm wanting to go to the paper written by that person and read what they have to say. So so for me, that's a battle. Let's use these tools to analyze, to search, to find, to synthesize even, but let's keep the integrity of what is written and where the source comes from. And then we can talk about the problems and the bias that's built in, but it's much easier to talk to an individual. Did you check that? What do you think about that? What did your grandmother say about this? Than to question the big AI.
Yeah. Yeah, Burley, please help us wrap this up. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, so if there are no more questions in the chat and with KG and Fauzi, we can wrap this up. So I want to thank you for joining us, Sir Professor Peter Schubert, for your knowledge, for sharing your knowledge on LLMs and how it can impact the heritage and cultural sphere of our world, and KG and Fauzi for the insightful words in the final discussion. And thank you, Sir Ivan Hinares, SEACHA chairperson, for joining us as well. And Gio Absede, our president of Heritage Conservation Society, for joining us. And everyone who joined in our chat time number 33 session, thank you again for joining us. And we'll be having another chat time session, the 34th, next month. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks all.
Bye, Prof. Peter.